Thanks, Brittany, and thanks for joining everybody. Today's topic is House Liaison Work as a Strategic Enrollment and Student Success Investment. And usually I feel like my titles are like a little more, pithy and fun, but I feel like this is serious business. This is a topic that came up at this year's summit, kind of in conversation with some of you about as we're kind of moving to institutionalize liaison work and how colleges are maybe perceiving it more as kind of a social work endeavor rather than something that's really an integral piece of student success. So I ruminated on that for a little while and then started kind of thinking about ways you can really connect your work to some student success initiatives going on at your institution, how we can kind of think about data and ways to pair that with your work if you're not already thinking about those pieces and parts. So I wanted to just kind of pull all that together in a single webinar. So we'll see if this hits at all. So I thought I would start with just a little bit around basic needs and student success in terms of what other folks are seeing around the country, and then do a little bit of a recap of inputs, outputs, and outcomes. Last spring 25, we did a webinar that looked at that specifically. So if you came to that webinar, great, you're going to be a little bit ahead of the curve. If you didn't, don't worry, I'm going to hit you with the basics here. And then we're going to talk about some other campus-wide programs and kind of common themes where I feel like using house liaison work as a student success and retention initiative kind of feeds these other moving parts. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about data so that when you're requesting data, you're asking for the things that'll really help you demonstrate the value of your work. And then finally, a few resources for you. Okay, so when we currently talk about student success, these are the kinds of things that are really kind of popping right now, right? So the first thing is that we're looking at access, not just how we used to look at it, which was like, we're an open door institution, everybody comes here, but now we're really looking at using community colleges as a vehicle for economic mobility for students and graduates. So we're going to kind of get more into that next week at our next webinar where we talk about career pathways. So if you want to kind of hear more about that, come to next week's show. This webinar, we're really going to talk about kind of these other things here. So one of the other trends in student success is thinking about how we onboard students. And we used to really have a transactional advising model where students came, they met with one advisor, they registered for classes, they got into seats, and off we went. When it was time for registration, they came back, maybe got the same advisor, maybe got a different advisor, probably got a different advisor, long wait times, all that kind of stuff. So now we're moving away from that kind of transactional model more to this kind of purposeful relationship-based model, generally around caseloads, which I think also kind of sings the same song potentially as house liaisons. And really, when we look at that kind of design, what we're seeing is increases in persistence so that student enrollment from fall to the next spring, and then also increases in student retention, which is fall to fall enrollment. So looking at like this fall to then next fall. Another trend is really partnering student affairs and academic affairs and thinking about ways to kind of clarify the various pathways. So sort of kind of leading back to the idea about like access for economic mobility, but thinking about like, what are the stackable credentials that'll get you there? What pieces and parts kind of need to be made a little more transparent for students to be able to access those pathways more easily. And to do that, you have to be in partnership with your academic affairs colleagues. Again, thinking also about how you are already working with faculty, kind of pulling them into education and training efforts for housework, Also kind of working with them to make referrals for students to kind of push out information about the all the different kind of services and moving parts that you offer. So that's all kind of embedded in that one. And then finally, the last trend, which I feel like we've been talking about this for at least 20 years at this point, but it's, I guess, good to know it's still a hot trend. The idea that we're using data to inform our decision making at our institutions, and particularly in terms of student success and what to invest in when we're looking at student success initiatives. So when we look kind of what other data do we have to kind of point to, and what are other colleges seeing? There was a large study done by Schoolhouse Connection. I feel like most of you have heard of them. And they partnered with Trellis Strategies and looked specifically at college students who are experiencing homelessness and what that meant in terms of their academic achievement. So these are the kinds of things that they found. Again, like, I don't think any of you are going to be wildly shocked by this, right? Like, we noticed that students miss at least one day of class because they don't have a reliable way to get to campus. What I think is kind of interesting about that, though, is that's twice the rate for students who are housed. These students also tend to work more hours and more jobs, and that tends to result then in more work and school schedule conflicts, which is another reason why sometimes classes are missed or assignments maybe aren't completed. Also, because of work and school, these students tend to engage in campus life a little bit less than their housed counterparts. The overwhelming majority of students experiencing homelessness are first-generation college students. So again, to be thinking about the initiatives at your institution that specifically look at first-generation students, and you'll have some synergy there. And then also thinking about kind of, again, like as like a Venn diagram here, the percentage of students experiencing homelessness who report having been in foster care. So it's 5%, but then look at that other piece, right? It's 5 times the rate for students who are housed. So I do feel like there's a strong overlap between those student populations that House is serving. Also, some of you, I think, may also be familiar with Sarah Goldrick-Robb, who used to be at the Hope Center. And she did this huge lit review trying to figure out, like, what is the time and effort students who are unhoused spend versus the time and effort students who are housed spend kind of in all student life activities. So she found, again, not unlike what Connection saw, which is higher rates of missed classes, less time to participate in study groups, which again then impacts success. That these students tend to opt out of extracurricular activities. They also don't often buy the required textbooks and tend to drop classes once housing issues kind of take the center stage in their lives. And then the Hope Center just released a study earlier this month. It was this longitudinal study looking at students and trying to figure out, like, how basic needs impacts student success. And you can see here my little arrow there at the bottom. So more than a third of students who experienced food insecurity or homelessness in the first year of enrollment were no longer enrolled by year 3. So that right there, I think, shows how the work that you do has the ability to make an impact on student success, persistence, retention, right? If we know that, like, generally speaking, without some kind of intervention, that those students are not going to complete, they will have disappeared after the second year of enrollment. And then these are some projects I think are worth highlighting, where these are all projects where institutions invested in basic needs and connected it to student success as the metric. So when they're trying to measure how successful a particular program is, they're using this kind of data. So Hudson Community College in New York gave out stipends, and the students who received stipends passed 90% of their classes, and they also had almost 100% fall to spring persistence. Here in Illinois, City Colleges of Chicago partnered with 1 Million Degrees, and then 1 Million Degrees does a lot of the wraparound services for students, and they found an increase in full-time enrollment, which again is a way you can tie the work that you're doing to revenue being generated at your institution. It also increased first year fall to spring persistence. It also increased degree completion. And then they actually did the math to look at how much revenue increases per student. So you can see here that there's a $3,000 increase of revenue that's achieved for each student that's retained. So I like, great job there kind of identifying the value of this kind of work. And then Bunker Hill Community College did meal vouchers and then noticed that students who received those vouchers attempted and completed more credits and were also more likely to graduate. So anytime we're seeing students persist or retain, attempt and complete more credits, that all also drives revenue at your institution. So kind of connecting those dots about persistence and retention and revenue, I think is a key piece of this puzzle. There also was this group, which I think is really fascinating. So it's the Center for Higher Education Policy and Practice, and its home is actually Southern New Hampshire University, right? The big, largely online institution. And they looked at how they could use her funds during COVID to support basic needs. They tried 10 different strategies, and the 3 strategies that had the best impact on student success and retention were these 3 things. So hopefully this should make you feel pretty good, because I think most of you were already doing these kinds of things. So the first was providing emergency grants. And the grants that they gave were anywhere from $300 to $2,000. So like kind of a range there. But being aware that like even a small amount of money, like $300, can really be impactful for students. So I know sometimes we feel like we just don't have enough money to do everything, but I felt like that was kind of a positive thing there. And then direct services was another bucket that got really good results. So providing actual student housing at their campus was one of the direct services. But they also did things like food pantries and meals, transportation, mental health, childcare, all the kinds of things that we're trying at our institutions too. And then finally, having folks like you to help coordinate the basic needs. So those were the 3 that got the best results. And you can see here kind of their data table. They ran Group A, Group B, and Group C. Were done by semesters. So it's not a correlate to the 10 strategies exactly. But when you look at the increase in persistence among the students who were funded, the overall persistence is almost 16%. So again, like the more that we can get students to persist and then connect that piece of data to the work that you're doing, I feel like is kind of the secret sauce of this work. So before I move on, does anybody have questions about that chunk of information so far? If so, go ahead and put it in the chat. I'll take a second. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about inputs, outputs, and outcomes. Or as I like to call it, claiming your impact. And I'm going to tell a little bit of a story here. So before I worked in higher ed, when I worked in social services, and we were trying to think about like how our programming was contributing to students, in our case, our client base being able to maintain housing, we looked at different kinds of activities that the clients participated in, trying to think about like, was there a correlation between certain kinds of activities and certain kinds of outcomes? And ultimately what we realized was students who were engaging in our activities did persist in housing better than folks who were not participating in our activities. So were we the only thing contributing to that success? No. But still, did we claim it as partially our victory? Yes. So as we think about inputs, outputs, and outcomes, I want you to think about outcomes like persistence and retention. where you're not the only player who's contributing to that outcome. That's true. But I think we can argue here, based on that previous data we were just looking at across the country, that you can argue that what you do has an impact, so you can claim that impact. So when we talk about inputs, outputs, and outcomes, inputs are all the stuff you put into the project. So any resources, that can be money, that can be people, that can be food, it can be transportation vouchers, right? Like any of the kinds of things that we kind of put together as the packages. And then outputs are the actual activities. So how many students used the food pantry, how many students received those transportation vouchers or did rideshare, or however we kind of do that, right? How many referrals to the continuum of care or to a shelter provider, all of those kinds of things. How many students received emergency funds, that all of that is the outputs. And then the outcomes is basically looking at what changed as a result of students receiving those outputs. So inputs are the resources, outputs are the activities, and then the outcome is what changed as a result of all of this effort. And again, ideally, the argument that we're really making is persistence, retention, and completion. So again, like inputs can be things like money, staff, space to do your work, supplies, technology, community partners. All of those are the resources that go into your program. And then the outputs, so I'm saying it's the activities or the services, right? It's anything you do that's sort of the evidence that you really implemented the program. So any materials, if you developed standard operating policies and procedures, thinking also about like how you're documenting the number of students served and the number of services provided, those are all outputs of your effort. And then outcomes, again, can be short-term, mid-term, long-term. So short-term may be things like the student was able to complete the week of classes, right? Or like they made it past the drop time. Midterm could maybe be they made it to the end of the semester. Long term is they returned in the following semester, they returned the following fall, they completed a certificate or a degree, right? And again, thinking about outcomes in terms of what are the changes that we're seeing in the lives of the students because of the interventions that you developed and provided. And again, that they don't need to be solely the result of your specific program, but you can be pretty confident that the outcome is in some way associated with your program. And then I thought this might be helpful. Heartland Community College was one of the institutions that received a grant in 2025 for their housework. And I thought this was kind of a good way to talk about outcomes. So they did talk about outputs, but then they also kind of shifted to think about what are the outcomes. So to look at things like 71% of students completed the semester by passing at least one course and maintaining good academic standing, that 76% of the recipients re-enrolled in the subsequent semester, right? And then 2 students actually completed their academic programs. So thinking about those kinds of outputs, right? Persistence, retention, and completion, and then connecting it back to folks who are receiving the services. Okay. So when you think about the work that you've done, what is an outcome that students have achieved that because of the house services they received? And again, remember, it can be something that you co-own with somebody else, right? So if you want to think like academic success is maybe also a product of tutoring or faculty support or good advising, like that's fine. But if you had a hand in it, then let's think about that as also a victory that you can claim. So I want you to think about like what's one outcome students have achieved because of the house services, And then how do you kind of then position that as a student success outcome? So how do you kind of frame that as student success? So in terms of things like persistence, retention, and completion. So take a minute and put it into the chat. And I'll give us about a minute to kind of get all that figured out. And then I'll have you hit enter and we'll waterfall that. Yeah, Brooke, thank you for mentioning that, right? Because we could also talk about students who transfer out and do that as one of the outcomes of the program too, right? Because I keep focusing on completion, but you're right. Like if students are going to transfer, then transfer out is definitely another outcome. And then I think for stability too, trying to think about like what does that look like as the outcome? Like what's going to be the piece of data that we point to that says like, okay, that's an indicator of stability. And it could be something like GPA, maybe, right? Like if we think like kind of back to what Heartland was looking at, kind of making sure that everybody successfully passed a course and that they remained in academic good standing, like thinking about stability kind of in those metrics, I think could be helpful. Okay, if others of you think of things, just go ahead and put them in there. I'm going to go ahead for the sake of time and keep us pushing along. So really, I'm asking you to think about like how do you position that in terms of outcomes, and really thinking about those data points is going to be the thing to do to kind of pull this together and demonstrate it to um, your folks at your institution. So I wanted to just point out like there's a piece of the report where institutional research at your institution is basically going to complete this A1 submission that's part of the larger data collection effort in Illinois. And there's a section in there now, a bubble in there for students who are homeless and students who are in care. And so that number is going to get pulled over into your House liaison report from the A1 submission. And then again, like kind of what's the 1-year retention rate for students experiencing homelessness and students in care. And again, this is going to be auto-populated from the A1 report. Now, the A1 report is made up of these kinds of things. So looking at enrollment, it looks at the unduplicated head count and then disaggregates it by gender, age, race or ethnicity, and program classification. It also looks at academic program. So which are they doing transfer, career and tech ed, general studies. You can see all the other options here, vocational, adult ed, et cetera, et cetera. So it looks at what are they enrolled in, and then for completion, which degrees and certificates were awarded, and across kind of all categories, including adult ed, and then also looking at completions disaggregated by race and ethnicity to academic program. So all of this bundling goes into the A1 report. And then for you to think about other pieces that are connected to the A1 are things like retention rate. So fall to fall is retention. And then this is like the official definition, right? Like the rate at which the undergraduate students return from fall to fall. They also include then anybody who graduated out also counts kind of as retained. And then completer is how many students received an undergraduate degree or certificate. And then there's a lot of other data that you have at your institution, either for other reports or just for other kinds of reasons data is collected. There's a lot of reasons. So this is a screenshot of a data dashboard from Joliet Junior College. And one of the things I really like about this is it's a public-facing dashboard. Your institution may have a public-facing dashboard, they may not. But if you're so inclined, go visit JJC's just to see all the different kinds of data that is collected so that you can start to think about like, hey, these would be some interesting data points to connect to my students identified as experiencing homelessness or in care from the A1 report. These would be other data points that you could look at. So you can see I've kind of put a list here of all the different things. This in particular looks at fall to fall retention. And then you can even use the different toggles at the top to look at enrollment full-time or part-time, gender, age, race. And then you can also kind of see at the bottom, there are a couple other charts to look at that are just looking specifically by race or gender. But they do a lot of other data collection. So you can also look at credits attempted versus credits completed. You can look at individual course success rates also. So like if you know you have a course at your institution that's like a major gatekeeper, that's like English 101 or Rhetoric 101. If you know that's a course that students have to have because that then opens as a prereq to other kinds of courses, you could also look at how students receiving house services are doing in those courses that are kind of gatekeepers versus students who aren't receiving services or students who are homeless or in care who are not receiving services. So you can do a lot of different data analysis. And again, fall to fall retention, fall to spring persistence. You can disaggregate by ethnicity, gender, age. You can even look at course format and see, is there a difference in how your students are performing in online courses, hybrid courses, traditional face-to-face courses. GPA, I do think is like a great piece of data, and you have that one because grades are getting submitted all the time. And then also certificates and degrees awarded. Again, sometimes that I think gets maybe trickier than it needs to be, just because sometimes students don't apply for the certificate that they earned, especially. But then also looking at transfer out rates, and then also looking at students full-time versus part-time. Okay, and then I can see there's a new comment in here, so I'm looking to see. Yeah, so Jennifer, yep. Yes, so looking at emergency rental assistance and then thinking about what they can do to kind of stay on track. Yeah. Yeah, and thinking again, it's connecting pieces of data, right? So if you have a piece of data that the student is experiencing homelessness or is a student in care, and then they received an emergency fund, and then they were able to persist from fall to spring, or they were retained from fall to fall, or they maintained their GPA, right? Like think about what's a piece of data that you could ask for to kind of demonstrate there's an outcome for providing that activity or that output, right? So like the output is giving that emergency fund, but it's really the outcome then of maintaining their GPA or doing fall to spring persistence or fall to fall retention. Like the reason we're really putting the money into this is because the students are going to be able to persist and complete over time, right? Or transfer out if that's the goal. And then I was also thinking, for those of you who were at the summit the year before last, there was a data session, and Anna Wonke from Rock Valley College, who's done a tremendous data initiative at her institution with their institutional researcher, pointed out that like data is only as good as where you capture and store it. So at Rock Valley, they have questions on their admission application about, and you can see them, these are the questions, right? Have you ever been in the foster care system? And do you have reliable housing? So they've gone like the least jargony way possible to get students to try to self-identify, but they put it on the application because when they put it on the application, there's a place in their data structure for that piece of data to live. So once that piece of data is in the system, now it gets a lot easier to connect it to other data points. So if you currently don't have a way to collect that data and put it into your data structure, to me, that's the first thing you want to work on this year. Because without that, you're going to end up doing an insane amount of hand tallying of things, which you are probably already engaged in, right? So if you can have it where there is a place inside the data structure where this piece of data can live, now when you do a query, you can just say, hey, I need this question from the application, and then cross-reference it with this list of students. And you may have to give them, like, here's a list of student numbers for students who got emergency funds, and then I want to know GPAs, right? So trying to figure that kind of piece out. And you can see here too, like Anna even says, like there are a bunch of pros to this, but the cons are like, you're going to have conversations about whether or not this sort of clutters the admission application. And then also can be perceived as a barrier to applying, right? Like students may not want to really click the answers to these, or other people may think like, wow, you must have a huge number of students in foster care or students experiencing homelessness. So sometimes those are just issues that are going to need to kind of get talked through a little bit. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about data, think about what are some of the pieces of data that you might want to use to demonstrate outcomes? And then go ahead and put them in the chat. And I'll give you a minute to kind of get your thoughts together. Yeah, Brooke has a great question. How she wants to know how everyone is collecting their data. What platforms are you using, or how is information pulled? So I'll let other folks who are actually at the colleges doing the work, how are you collecting data currently? Because Brooke, what I've seen is sort of a bit of a mix of folks who are really leaning into their data systems at their institutions and folks that are really kind of keeping track of things more manually. So folks are maybe having an Excel spreadsheet and they're keeping track of students that way. But other, like at Rock Valley, where there really is a place in their data structure to hold that information, they have a whole dashboard then that pretty much I believe anyone on the campus can use to kind of get a gist of how students experiencing homelessness or students in care are performing, and kind of across various measures. If you want, I'll put you in touch with Anna at Rock Valley. I have my email at the end of this show. Brooke, if you grab my email and send me your email, I will send you Anna's info. Okay. And then if other folks have other ideas other than what I said, definitely put it in the chat for Brooke. Thank you. Okay. And then this other piece I wanted to talk to you was, I don't really think the work that you do is in isolation. I think the work that you do is connected to multiple campus-wide initiatives. And I'm going to just highlight three, but there are many more. So hopefully as I'm talking about this, hopefully you'll be thinking like, oh yes, also this, also that. That is the hope. So one of the things I think it's obviously going to connect to is the strategic plan. Every institution has a strategic plan. Some are widely available online, as you can see my examples. But also at your institution, if you're currently in the planning process and you're able to participate, definitely participate, right? Like go and represent the students, that you work with in-house and in aspects of your job. This is something I think was pretty good in terms of like a good general broad goal. And usually there are goals like this that are student focused, and then other goals that are more about like facilities and then kind of, community partnerships, right? So these different kind of buckets. But this goal, this is from Bucks County Community College in Pennsylvania. And the goal is that Bucks will help students meet their academic and career goals. And then you can see here they have 4 strategies. And I feel like if you look at the strategies, some of these are probably the kinds of things that House liaison work supports, right? So especially these kinds of pieces, like if we're going to build and strengthen supports for student groups with low retention, I feel like that's, a big piece of what you all do. I also think potentially like number 4, like strengthening communication with students and increasing faculty and staff knowledge about college resources and processes. Again, I think that's another piece that you probably do, frankly, kind of a lot of. And then closer to home, this is a piece of the strategic plan from Elgin Community College. And this is their teaching and learning excellence imperative. They organize a little bit different. It's like, I want to say they have maybe like 4 imperatives and then under that goals. So this is the teaching and learning excellence imperative. And you can see here, goal number 1 is all about completion. And here they're looking at completion as credits attained. So the completion goal is really not just specifically like completing this many certificates and this many degrees, but instead they're looking at how to increase credit hours earned per student. So again, like when you're thinking about your data that you would like to connect to the housework, this is an idea here that you could look at what's the number of credits that students are earning, are successfully completing, right? So strategic plan is definitely one kind of college-wide initiative I think you guys connect to. Another one is strategic enrollment management. So again, almost every institution I have been affiliated with has had something literally called strategic enrollment management. Sometimes it's a very large committee. Sometimes it's literally 3 people figuring stuff out. So depending on the size of your institution, it could be a large group, it could be a small group. It typically either comes from enrollment services, the registrar's office, registration, right? Or it comes from marketing. So, or it's both of those things. So I liked this piece from Mesa Community College in Arizona. I thought they did a nice job, kind of just in a nutshell, here's what strategic enrollment management is, which is basically to figure out like what's your optimum way to operate so that you meet all of your targets for recruiting and enrolling students, retaining them and graduating them. And then and then here, if you look over here, the plan will have various and sundry strategies, goals, activities. So here again, if we look at the strategy is optimizing student success, the goal is retaining and supporting students to reach those goals. And then the activity is basically developing low-cost retention strategies, right? And then the milestones are all of these data points where you could think about like, hey, we can mimic something like that when we're looking at house liaison statistics and data. So again, and you'll see this idea of like increasing fall to fall, increasing fall to spring, like the percentage of folks completing those kinds of gateway courses around English, or here they also use math, right? So I feel like this kind of strategic enrollment management plan and group at your institution is another place where you can kind of look at where are we aiming our arrow as an institution, and then kind of align your data quest accordingly so that you're really supporting these larger initiatives. And again, reframing the work that you do, and that it's not about purely a social service endeavor that's happening at your institution, but really that it's part of these larger student success initiatives. And then finally, the ICCB program review. So this is a cycle that is on a 5-year schedule. So I put the schedule over here on the right if you're curious. Like basically, there's a review area for each of the major areas at the college. So like academic student support, interdisciplinary instruction, and career and tech ed. And then each year it rolls to a slightly different area. So you can see like the academic disciplines, it goes communications, math, science, humanities, social and behavioral, and then the cycle starts all over again. And then with career and tech ed, same thing, it kind of rolls across the different kinds of CTE programs, and then same for student and academic support services. So it starts with admissions and records, and then it moves towards kind of student service supports, and then financial aid, and then disability counseling and library, and then athletics and student activities. So if you didn't already get pulled into this, I would imagine probably either in the financial aid piece or in the counseling and advising piece, depending on where you're situated at your institution. This is an opportunity, though, for you to kind of raise your hand and offer your data and your thoughts about how your work connects to these larger pieces. So the form, if you follow the link at the bottom, it'll take you to the manual with all of the forms in it. I took the student and academic support service form and just sort of clipped a few pieces of it for you, because I thought these are places where you can kind of see your kind of common mission, right? So on the first page over here on the left, looking at how the program or service contributes to the mission of the college, looking at how the program or service helps to advance equity on your campus. Again, like the overarching goals and objectives of the program and service, and to what extent are these being achieved. So again, looking at data, thinking about how you measure and assess the objectives for your house liaison work. And then the middle page is a page a little further down the road in the program review, where it looks at quality indicators for the services that you're providing. So looking at student success and how your intervention has had an impact on student success. Down here toward the bottom, looking at like continuous improvement for your work as a house liaison, thinking about how you use data, how that helps you to kind of drive meaningful changes and developments in the program. And then finally, that last box is again around disaggregated data and what are you using and how are you showing that it demonstrates program effectiveness. So this to say, the program review, if you haven't ever been involved in the process, definitely get involved in the process. If you don't know who to ask, your dean for sure will know. Other folks who know are probably your institutional research folks. They usually prepare the data for this particular item. And then I do think there are a few other campus-wide opportunities that for the sake of time, we did not get into for today. So you may have a belonging plan where the work that you do can feed those kinds of efforts. There's also a Carl Perkins work plan. I'll try to talk a little bit about that next week too, when we're talking about careers. That's really for CTE programs. But there's a section where we need to talk about how we serve special populations, and students in care and students experiencing homelessness are special populations. Connected to the Perkins work is this comprehensive local needs assessment. Again, that also looks at equity and special populations. So the work that you do serves both of those items. You may also have the Workforce Empowerment Initiative at your college, which is trying to look at how to bring certifications and high demand industries and occupations to folks who otherwise are unable to kind of access that pathway. So there may be some overlap there. And then the other thing most colleges are really looking at right now is students who have some college but no degree. So if you're finding that your students that are coming to you as a house liaison and they have some credits, but they have not completed a degree. The initiatives at your institutions looking at how to better serve that student subgroup could maybe also be another place for you to add your voice. So these are all, again, just additional kind of campus-wide initiatives where I think you may have some synergy. So I wanted to also give you these links and others are throughout the presentation, but I kind of just wanted to highlight these few. So the Center for Higher Education Policy and Practice, CHEP, which is that group that really looked at like the 10 different kinds of interventions and the 3 that basically are house liaison work and their impact. Thought that would be a good link to just sort of pull out and put here. There's also this really great piece by the Community College Daily talking about what they call the student success dividend. So looking at how student success drives other kinds of mechanisms, such as revenue. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then here too, thinking about like how student success drives revenue at the institution, but then also drives revenue in the community when students are successful. So I thought that was kind of a great piece. I also just wanted to mention the House Grantee Handbook. So I featured the work from Heartland, but all of the grantees, there were 11 grantees in 2025, and this handbook gives you a summary of everybody's projects and what they found and what they did with their money. And then again, a few other resources if you want to try to implement those ideas themselves. And then finally, that Schoolhouse Connections, Trellis Strategies, longitudinal research about basically students and the housing crisis and what that's really doing in higher ed. Okay, so if you have questions for me, put them in the chat or raise your hand and Brittany will unmute you. Brooke, this is the place where you should grab my email so that you can email me. So I'll pause briefly while you grab that. And then I'll come back to that in a second. I did just want to kind of do a cheap promotional moment for next week. We have a lot going on next week. So next week, we're doing office hours for house implementation. So we're going to have Dina Schenk with us, who is going to talk about the 2% threshold for calculating basically the house liaison required positions, and then also how you can create a job description if you are in that 2%, to have a house liaison as the primary function of the position, but then there can be some other functions that you do at the institution. So we're going to give you a couple of examples of those, and then any questions or topics that you have from the floor. So again, Brooke, your question about data and how are people doing this, and that this will be basically the same office hour. We're just going to do it on June 22nd and June 23rd. So 1 o'clock on the 22nd, 10 o'clock on the 23rd, same session. And then on the 24th, I'll be back to do a webinar with you about career pathways and student access and how we want to think about that when we're working with house students. So so activities pretty much all week long. All week long next week. And Brittany just dropped in the registration for the webinar and the office hours. The link can be found at the center. I can totally add my email to the chat. Yes, indeed.
All right. Well, thank you, Patty. Appreciate the information. And yes, as you said, I put that link so that technically 2 separate links, but it all takes you to the same place. And it has the registration for the upcoming webinars. And then typically what I do is where you see the registration link for this current webinar, I'll take that out, I'll put the recording and then the slide deck under there. So that House Liaison Center really is your one-stop shop for all of the resources that we support and develop with ICCB. So thank you all for joining us. If you're getting hit by today's weather, I hope you stay safe and hopefully it doesn't get as bad as they're saying it's going to. But we appreciate all of the work that you do and hope to see you on next week's webinar and office hours as well.